Hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Nadine Khalil. I'm an independent culture critic based in Dubai, originally from Lebanon. And I have with me a conceptual artist from the UAE, as Yusuf mentioned, Zeinab Hashemi, who is quite well known for her site-specific large-scale installations and public commissions with various partners. Today we're going to look at the evolution of her work and how it reflects a certain art scene in the UAE, a particular art scene that worked with land art and performance, which are genealogies that influence Zeinab somewhat, even though, as you will see, she has her own visual language. So we're going to be looking at that and also at the work that she has constructed for Art Egypt called The Unfinished Obelisk. This work was supported by the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Foundation and also by the Ministry of Youth and Culture in the UAE. So to begin, I would like to show you some of Zeinab's early works, very early in 2012, so we're talking 10 years ago. This is Circumvolution State of Mind, and it was shown in the Sharjah Biennial, which is still considered one of the best biennials in the region, really focusing on the global south, South Asia, but also the Arab world. And this was made out of fish nets. And as you can see, it's a very large dome-like installation. Maybe Zeinab, you can tell us a little bit more about one of your earliest outdoor sculptures.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you very much for coming here. So I think part of my upbringing and part of my study and education had gave me the opportunity to question what is art or what is contemporary art. And I think once I started experimenting, I noticed that my interest in general is to look at the things that are sometimes overlooked. So I can look at them again, give the audience another chance to look at them. So, and I've worked around a lot of materials between, I would say, found objects, but at the same time, my found objects could be a construction site where my visual element is a lot of metal mesh, wires, concrete, so a lot of raw materials. That was the beginning, I would say. So over here, the way that this work was presented is that it was opposite to a mina. It's opposite to a port. So basically, I just took all of the mesh, that is it's called the fish net, but we call it gargur. I just took it and placed it on top of the house, and then suddenly you see it as if it's looking like a dome. But when you're standing on the terrace, you're also looking at all of the mosques with the domes. And when you're standing down the house, you think that that's actually almost like a silhouette of a dome. That was the whole, I guess, idea behind it. Which,
it's beautiful. It's like the shadow of what you see outside the city. And let's move on to the next work. But this gives an idea. Qasr al-Hassan. Maybe you can also say something about the significance of this building as well.
So I think the building in general, wherever I have my work presented, I'm interested in site-specific. Site-specific meaning I study the space, I study the building, I study the people that are coming to the building, and what was the purpose behind it. The cultural foundation in this building stood as an art foundation in general, as the history of contemporary art over the first generations of artists. Not to take too long on this artwork, but I think I like to kind of abstract whatever I'm looking at or whatever the audience is looking at. And I allow some time also an ability for some imagination. So this is a structure that is very similar to the sailing boat. But again, like I take whatever I'm looking at and I abstract it. I only work with shapes and lines. And I think that in the beginning, I would not say that I was working with, like later on I started working with geometry, but at this point, I think by 2014, I was really experimenting. So the ropes that you see are the ropes from a sailing boat. So I would collect those kind of materials and then recreate them in a space, reposition them in a way where you look at it and you question yourself whether what you're looking at is what is actually related to the work, or maybe it's, you give it a new meaning sometimes.
I mean, I love this work because it's maybe one of the softest sculptures you've ever made. And I know that there's actually some others, but in relation to the urban landscape. And it's really not just site-specific, but it responds to the architecture, I feel, in a very playful way, whereas the works that come after, you've exercised a bit more control and mastery, and you're really working with metal and scaffolding and hard industrial materials. And so I think it's interesting because when we go to your work now here in Egypt, it's like an attempt to merge those two parts of your practice, the organic and the inorganic, in an interesting way. But I want us to move to the next slide and talk about why your work is interesting for those of you who are not aware of the wider UAE context. It's a context that basically contemporary art really began to become well known in the 80s, 90s, and it began with a group of 5 artists who were around Hassan Sharif, and they were called the 5. One of them is Muhammad Ahmed Brahim, who does, I guess, land art, art in, that is outdoors and remains outdoors in the environment. So these are all, I mean, not necessarily direct influences from what I understood from Zeinab's practice, but this was the generation before you, basically. And I think what's interesting is that whereas the installations that Muhammad Ahmed Brahim, Hassan Sharif, and then their student, Ibtisam Abdelaziz, who we'll also see here, did, really are performative installations. Here you see Hassan Sharif, maybe you could say something about the materials, the assemblage, the found objects he uses also affected you in some way to how to look at material, right, from what is around you.
Okay, I think it's important for me to mention that when I studied as an education, I studied art history, I studied all different kinds of studio works, painting, photography. At some point we studied a little bit of sculpture. One thing I noticed is after graduating, I wanted to know the UAE artists, who were the artists that were in the region. So Emirati artists that are practicing contemporary art. And I think one of the first names that come to your mind if you research about UAE contemporary artists is the most, like I would say, the godfather of contemporary art in the UAE is Hassan Sharif. So definitely I felt so much connected at that point, graduating as a young artist. It definitely influenced me. He had a studio which was called the Flying House. The Flying House was the art hub, or like
people
an art
gather.
house where people just gathered, and artists, creatives would gather, chat, talk, create work all the time. Much older than my generation. So they were the ones that I looked up for. So I think it definitely influenced my work in a way or another, and collected materials and objects that are found.
Found material. And then if we move a little bit further, we'll see, so these are his performative actions as well. And then there is Ibtisam Abdelaziz, which I think is also, I don't know if she's your generation, she's older than you, yeah?
So Hassan Sharif is considered from the first generation of Emirati artists. So he started back in the 80s. And then I think Ibtisam was slightly young. She is younger than Hassan Sharif generation. So we move a little bit forward to...
And the reason why I thought it was interesting to note Ibtisam Abdelaziz, because she is one of the rare artists who's really, she's performing numbers. Here it's a lot to do with mathematics, and Zeinab, also your work is influenced by numbers, but your body is very much absent in your work, even though there is a relationship that we'll get to. So here you see the beginnings, it's a really young art scene, like in the early 2000s, of art not only being outdoors as public art, but also being performed publicly. And I mean, Ibtisam has like many interesting stories about the reaction of the public. But yeah, so it's quite interesting, because here we're talking about public art, but we're also, whenever you talk about public art, you need to think of who is the art for, but also who are the publics. So in this case, it's just the everyday worker, whoever is there, and she would just spend long hours doing her performances, right?
Just for me to add, I think Ibtisam really also pushed the boundaries of what an Arab woman as a performance artist can do in her own very intelligent, smart way, you know. So I think that that was really one of the highlights of performance artists back in that time.
Yeah, and just like a bit of context, autobiography takes her back statements and she has them printed on her body in this way. And we can move now to one of the works that I feel of yours that, you know, really performed publicly, whereas the other works were kind of installed in more artistic context. It's The Concrete Blood of 2013, right?
The first, I would say, working with scale, optical illusion. So basically, I think the location, again, the location matters a lot in my work. This is Dubai International Financial Center, known as one of the art districts where there are galleries, but at the same time it's a financial district where there are most of the biggest companies around. So I think I wanted to play a little bit with the idea of what is art, and especially back in 2013. Growing up around the UAE, I saw all of the transformation that was happening, and I wanted to sort of like, as if I wanted to give credit to the concrete block, because it's always like, I could see like all of the buildings getting built, but then you see them when they're complete, and I think we're gonna come back to the idea of what incomplete or raw materials mean to me. So I just wanted to recreate the concrete block and make it more noticeable, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And then in this case, this is a case where the object performs. So moving to metamorphic, the reason why we wanted to show you two very different extremes in your practice is metamorphic is where you're really exercising. I mean, it's still raw, but there's a lot of control in making that work, right?
From 2009 up till 2015, 2016, those years were very good in my practice for me to sort of experiment and understand myself with materials, understand my artist statements even. As an artist, I was very keen to create, but I was not very, like I think the writing part was a little bit, I wasn't able to kind of put my words together. In terms of like what I really meant with the work. It meant so many things to me, but you know, to write them out was a sort of challenges. So I think I was making a lot of different objects and creating different works until I think 2018 here. Maybe you can introduce the work.
Yeah, so this was a work, it was a collaboration between the Louvre Abu Dhabi and France, and it worked with special artists from the UAE who were working on particular kinds of crafts, and based on the craft they were working with, they, you know, were able to access certain factories and production facilities in France in order to make the work. What I find so interesting about the work, it's really like a mosaic of colored glass, but at the same time, it requires, it's not as delicate as it looks. It requires so much control, and it's of such a large scale, so much larger than the human body, and so much about doubling and fragmenting vision. I mean, I think you even once said it was a pixelated map, and the materials and colors come from Abu Dhabi, come from the colors of Abu Dhabi, but yet you've used a lot of industrial and natural materials together in this work, that I always feel like your work is really a feat for your own body, but that's the invisible aspect of it, the invisible gesture, the invisible performance, you know?
I think, of course, this opportunity to have my work as part of the program of the inauguration of Louvre Abu Dhabi was very important to myself, as to represent my first work in the museum as grand as the opening. So I researched a little bit about the Saadiyat Island where the museum is located, and this is how I usually start my work. I research a lot about the area and understand what catches my attention. And I think Saadiyat Island, if you look it up, it's one of the natural islands in Abu Dhabi. It's got so much history of people moving from the desert to the island during winter, just because it was like a fishing season. So I look at the definition of what that island meant, and today Saadiyat Island, it's redefined as a cultural district. There is the Louvre Abu Dhabi. There is the Guggenheim that's going to open. There is Sheikh Zayed National Museum, and there are many projects that are happening around the area. So it's going to become like a new, not a new, it's already existing, but it's the biggest destination for culture, art, and museums. What I felt was interesting is, again, I'm really, really interested into looking into what I call the evolution of our urban life. Construction, deconstruction. So we build, we demolish, we build again, we rebuild. We create man-made islands. We do all sorts of, I think, what I call human interference. And only recently I describe it as a human interference. But what you see here is the metal represents human interference, and the glass part is actually made out of the oldest glass blowing factory. And they do stained glass, where I asked them to recreate the colors of the Saadiyat Island. So you could see, first of all, I'm very, very obsessive when it comes to like where my work goes. So let's say I'm creating all those kind of colors of watercolors. I would actually take all of the pieces of glass and place them one by one for the fabricator and the workshop to help me create them. I just thought like showing the process is really interesting. You can see here like those colors look like the watercolors, the different level of water on the deep sea of Saadiyat. And yeah, I think that was like one of the most projects where I found myself like and understood more about my mediums, what I'd like to highlight in my work.
And this led to your latest show, Constructivism, which really kind of traces Zeinab's look at this rapidly changing urban landscape. Of course, everywhere there's urban development, but I think the way the UAE has moved at like such, at the speed of technology even, it's so fast. And so this idea of the unfinished building is interesting because it's just a short moment, an in-between state before it becomes something else, either before it's torn down and that's the moment that you try to fix and finish in your work using the materials such as scaffolding, such as steel structures, whatever you might use to kind of dictate this unfinished state that you then finish with, in this case for the first time, color, but also form, right?
I think I allow myself to sort of move away from the usual things I create every time. Like I allow the same, maybe I take one element from one of my previous works, another element from my from my other previous works, and I see the opportunity of them becoming something new again. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a story. So this is like one of the childhood memories of the photo here is not an old one, but if you see the trees over here, this is called Safa Park. If you're in Dubai, you know Safa Park very well. It was very popular in the 90s. And this is, I think, what moves me as an artist. And to see change in the way how we, as humans again, I call it human interference. I call it how we like to dominate over ourselves over nature in a way where this park was decided that it needs to be, I think 70% of the park had to be taken away to build a new canal, a man-made canal. And then they decided to create, real estate is big in Dubai. It's the biggest thing, and it's the most important part of the economy and business in Dubai. So they built all of those skyscrapers with, and I like to see what is the final, what's the final outcome of those buildings. But those buildings were left, they did not continue building them for at least 3 or 4 years. And I was seeing this scene every day as I drive. I see the city through that. I see the city skyline through those buildings. And I wonder, like, like how it's going to become at some point when they're going to be covered. But then this is where it caught my attention. The show is basically recreating those mesh, or for me, again, I work with metal, it looks like a mesh. Then I see the building and it looks like a mesh. I'm interested in grids. I'm interested in the geometry that we don't necessarily look at on a close level of nature or a building. So just like, you see, I just recreate those mesh in 3 elements, which was wood, nails, and metal beams. Again, there's something natural and something industrial. Just a little bit of like a process. Again, like I've got an obsession with numbers, with shapes, with repetition. I repeat things until I'm satisfied with what it looks like. Sometimes, let's say if I have 35, like let's say I have 35 pieces of wood, I would take one because I think the number 34 makes more sense to me. Don't ask me why. I have a thing for maybe even numbers in a way where I feel like this is how the combination of the look and feel should be.
And I think this relationship between the natural and artificial is kind of quite different in Dubai, where you have man-made a lot of things, man-made lakes, you know, a lot of things, man-made greenery, you know, so there, like the distinction blurs a little bit. But I find that interesting in your work because you incorporate that, but also this, where is the body in your work? Like, what is the relationship? Because you're always looking at something grander, and in this case, you went down in scale, but like, what is the relationship of body to architecture and architecture to body? This is something that really, I feel really impacts your work, but is not necessarily visual. You know what I mean?
I think, in addition on all of what you also said, like I would agree on the parts where I would see what the visual thing looks at as almost like a body to me, but then in a very abstract geometric way. But at the same time, I feel like geometry or architecture in a way is control, it's power. It's not organic, it's not just like happening with, it's not fluid, it's like put together with a plan. So I think this is where I'm not, I feel like I'm so much in control as well in my work. And
it's your body. Yeah.
It's probably, you know, you have a little bit of a background where I feel like I need to always be in control of what my work should look like. I dictate it, I direct how the outcome would look.
Yeah, often you say you force the metal to take the shape.
Correct.
So it's like working with a lot of people as well. But this idea of the body, I think, comes back through your use of the camel hide, which is another material that you've used very early in your work and has reappeared in your work with various numbering, like a process over time until it's culmination in Art Egypt right now, where it's not completely camel hide, but I find it an interesting approach because you would expect it to be a soft sculpture, but it's not in your practice ever, a soft sculpture.
So if I would just mention, like I did say in the beginning that there was a couple of years of experimental. While I was experimenting, I have to say, every single thing that would caught my attention, I give it an opportunity to see what I can make with it. And I think as a soft material, this is camel hides, camel leather. It's natural camel leather. It is available in the UAE because there's the biggest tannery in the region, in Al Ain. It was supported by the late Sheikh Zayed. It's, again, I think, you know, just like any other places around the world, I think we use all kinds of resources. So there are leather of different types of like animals that we use for different purposes, including the purpose of like fashion, luxury, all kinds of like uses. So I noticed that this sort of like commodity or leather, or even like looking at the camel from his living phase until after death is very interesting. It reminds me again about human interference. It reminds me about evolution. It reminds me about, even as an artist, how I think this topic is interesting to be highlighted in a contemporary environment, in an art scene. So I took that soft camel leather and I forced it to look very geometric, very hard in its shape. So that was the first time I ever used camel leather. Some time of like me reconnecting, I think, with different materials, and then there was a gap between 2015 until it appeared again in the Portrait of a Nation, the name of the exhibition, which highlighted a lot of different works from artists in the UAE and also artists practicing in the UAE. So different artists who have shaped the art scene in the region. And so this was, you know, I think by working with the curator.
Tell us about the numbering.
The numbering. Which one?
Of camouflage, how you number them.
So I think, again, like I did mention, I have an obsession. I'm sorry if my work can complicate or can confuse you a little bit. It's just that I think I'm trying to really talk out loud about how my brain works, how my practice works, how maybe in 10 years of working as an artist, I've tried to reinvent my work again and again in a way where I would not settle for that this is what I do and that's it. So I think this was the first camouflage. Again, like the title is camouflage because it's camel and camouflage. It's a combination of two words. And then the next one was Camouflage 1.5 that was showing in Portrait of a Nation sponsored by ADMAF. And again, in 2022, the camel leather appeared again as it made a lot of sense to move from an exhibition space all the way to land art or public art, which has become all of us, like we have noticed that there are events that would require art to be outdoors and in natural environment. So
yeah, relatively newly in the region, with Desert X spearheading this. But the work, I mean, you mentioned that the camel wraps the work, right? So the work is not actually just camel. It's supported by it. It has another support structure.
So the industrial part, or like the metal structure, is actually inside what makes the whole structure and makes it geometric. It makes it masculine. It makes it what you see at the moment. But the soft leather, the natural leather, is what covers it. So again, there's always that natural and industrial factor of the work. But over here, I tried to understand that when it was in an exhibition space, closed space, it was becoming, the camel hides were becoming and looking like sand dunes, as you can see again. This is like almost like abstract shapes of sand dunes, abstract shapes of sand dunes again.
Drawing the environment with the camel,
correct.
Right? Mm.
And then when I saw myself that I can actually show it in around sand dunes and in the desert, I realized that I wanted it to look like the rocks that were in Al-Ula desert. So this is what caught my attention as site-specific, which was, to me, a different type of desert, because I'm used to sand dunes in the UAE. When I went to Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, it was the rocks, the mountains. So these look like rock formations that have fell from the mountains, probably.
I think now we have 5 more minutes, so if you want to go into the story of the unfinished obelisk, which I feel really merges different elements of your practice, what we saw in constructivism earlier this year, and the early work that you have done with the camel hide as well.
So what I find it really interesting is that I always try to trust the signs that I get whenever I have a new project. So let's say that the opportunity of being part of Art Egypt has already, like, I'm already brainstorming. I have a good idea what is it that I want to create, and automatically when I thought that I'm showing my work around the Great Pyramids, so my first time to be in Egypt, I felt like I wanted to relate to it in a way that I can also express the theme of Art Egypt. But again, part of my, honestly, this is one of my passion, like I'm so passionate about ancient Egyptians that people actually sometimes, a lot of my friends, when they saw the work, they said, "You're home, you finally made it, it suits you," like start giving me those like words that they kind of understand that ancient knowledge was always something very important to me as a research base. So I knew I wanted to create an obelisk. So this is an obelisk where it's also, again, made out of metal structure and camel hides. But as I was researching about obelisks, I remember that there is the biggest obelisk in Aswan. So I started researching, and it's called the Unfinished Obelisk. It is still located in Aswan. It is the biggest to ever be built by the ancient Egyptian civilization, but the reason it was not completed is because when they build an obelisk, they create it out of one piece of granite, and then they erect the obelisk. So what happened was it showed some cracks. The cracks did not allow them to continue to finish the obelisk. And today, after thousands of years, it is still a historical place. It's a site that is being visited by millions. And this is the story where it made so much sense about the idea of incompleteness or unfinished or left buildings. And I thought that this is my story of my work as well. And I wanted to give a new opportunity for the unfinished obelisk to be recreated and seen around the theme of the Art d'Egypte with the structure of an unfinished building.
Yeah, but you also make the building very anthropomorphic by wrapping it with the desert, and then it becomes another building as well, right? The obelisk. When you look at it, it's like, oh, it's going to be finished. Like they've started on these floors, and then they're going to move up to the top, you know.
A lot of the artists that were also participating in Art d'Egypte whenever we gather, they say, "You haven't finished yet, right?" And I tell them, "No, it's finished." And someone was concerned. They're like, "You haven't finished the work yet, right?" And I was like, "It is finished. This is what it looks like." And I think I like this playfulness with my work again. I allow the audience to be questioning if it's actually, this is what it should look like, or it's incomplete.
I think it's also, I think we've mentioned cultural identity before, but not to typify it too much, but it really represents a certain visual language of the Arabian Peninsula, right? Like both the modern in construction building and the life of the desert, right? So in a way, it kind of really does represent a certain Gulf-based aesthetic, I would say, to a certain extent.
It represents a reality, the reality we live in. It represents, driving in the streets and then noticing that, oh, that building is demolished, or this building is still being built, or, oh, it has stopped being built for sometimes 10 years and sometimes over 100 years. And I think it talks about the story of our evolution and civilization, of like always, building the next big thing.
I think it's also something you noticed, because when you arrived in Cairo, you also noticed the state of certain buildings and abandoned states, and like it is where your eye is drawn, you know.
Definitely, as I was driving from the airport coming to, first thing I did is arrived from the airport and went to the site to see the pyramids, of course, since it's my first time to Egypt and Cairo, and also to see the work. And the universe gave me that sign, is because I was driving and I saw all of those houses and buildings that were either half, they're not demolished, because this is what I was told. In order to make the streets bigger and the highway bigger, they had to kind of take away, slice them. And I thought, wow, I could see the rooms of the people that were living in those buildings. And it was so interesting because all of the rooms were bright and the building from the outside were dull. It touched me a lot, and a lot of those also buildings were supposedly had to be finished, but I'm sure if you're from here, you know exactly that those buildings were not completed many, many years, over maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But I hope that, I think
I think we covered everything, but it's like also this sense of transparency and opacity that you're showing both here, whereas in Desert X, everything was covered. So there's also that element of what exists, what are the bones of a structure,
I like to play with negative and positive space. Again, just giving enough space for the structure to kind of breathe a little bit. And some things, sometimes it's a coincidence, sometimes it's an accident, sometimes I am quite sure until I fabricate, and while the work is getting done, I tell the guys at the workshop, I'm making some changes, and they get upset. But it doesn't matter, because I decided to trust that feeling in me, that it needs to become something else. It slightly needs to change. I kind of follow that in a way where it's, I think it's just like an artist's way of feeling
art is
what color it should be.
Yeah, the art is also a lot about transformation and transmutation, manipulation. So I would love to open up to questions, maybe 5 to 10 minutes of questions, if anyone has any for Zeinab. Any questions? If not, then I'll just ask.
Make sure you visit Art Egypt and see the work. Just showing some process pictures over here. And yeah, I think...
I guess no one has any questions? No? Okay, there's a question.
Thank you very much for telling us about your process, especially with this last piece that you mentioned. What ends up happening to the pieces that are site-specific, especially like this last one at the pyramids? Will that later be displayed in a gallery, or what will happen? Or will it be acquired and sort of hidden away in someone's house, or what's going to happen?
So I think in such a event like Art Egypt, there are different parts of the project. Personally, as an artist, I focus really on the experience that I'd like to give the public. And for me, I try not to distract myself from what would be the future, or where will it be stored, or how will we move it, or how I will ship it. The reason for that is I'd like to trust that it will either find its place, maybe it will be stored for many years and shown again in maybe 20 years later, you know, or someone will acquire it, or it will open doors to new projects. So I think I don't, personally, I don't take things into consideration. Definitely there's behind the scene work. There's the, you know, the teams from Art Egypt that we discuss things with. There's the gallery work. There are the collaborators' work, the sponsors. But honestly, like as an artist, I wear the hat of an artist here.
I can also add that there's been a wave in the Gulf for public art. Actually began in Qatar, a little bit in the UAE, very high intensity in Saudi, and these are public commissions by the government, eventually acquired for the city. Like there is one for Riyadh that I think is going to have, I think, 1,000 sculptures public. So Expo 2020 in the UAE also commissioned works, and these are now permanent works. But the thing is, land art today can no longer be what it was. In the past, it used to disintegrate with the landscape, the great land art pioneers of like James Turrell, Smithson, etc., you know, American School, right? So they created works that would disintegrate in the landscape. Now we have a market, and the works are, you know, made, sometimes dismantled, shipped away. So it's no longer even, it reflects the environment, but it's no longer in the environment, no longer remains. And obviously here, we're talking about a protected site, so it's different. Also, Al-Ula is a protected site, but they're creating something called Wadi al-Fan, the Valley of the Arts, where they're bringing some major artists, Agnes Dennis, James Turrell, and more, to create works for the place that will remain in the place. And this is, I think, a response to Desert X, where the works are only up there for like a month or two. So there is also this relationship with land art that has changed historically through time. And I mean, it's so different now. I feel like the older land artists really could show climate change through the work. Now an artist is commissioned to think about climate change and to make something that's actually not good for the environment, you know, and that's, you know, so it's kind of tricky.
It is. So I think I'd like to maybe end this talk by thanking all of the Art Egypt team, thanking EDMAF as a sponsor for this, for my commission as well, the Ministry of Culture in the UAE, and then my gallery, Leila Heller. As an artist, I can think of I can think of 100 ideas, but if I don't have the support and the sponsors and the funding, and it's not easy, I think it takes some time for you to be confident in your practice and allow people to trust you in your work as well, to be able to be encouraged in, to stand here along really international artists. I hope I'm the youngest one though. I'm not sure from all of the artists.
But,
You know,
but,
I used to be the youngest in the.
but the point is, you're not a gallery artist. You're not a white cube artist, and that's the thing. Like, you are either you have to work with commissions, you know. So your works are temporary, or at least they
Yeah.
started that way, right?
A lot of people, I think, from my generation, sort of try to find ways of exhibiting, not in the most traditional way of exhibiting in a white cube gallery. But then again, honestly, I also like to work within a space with group exhibitions or even just like a solo show. It's nice to be also in your studio with your work and practice without thinking that I need to think of scale, so I can think of smaller scale. But for now, it seems like the past few years have been big, as you said. There's a demand in the market, there's a demand in the region for public art, there's a demand for the public to be engaged in an open space with art. You visit the site, you see the art, you engage with the artist, you see the history, you see, you know, entertainment. There is.
It's also began with beautification and gentrification projects, but yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, there's definitely a big move. But okay, without further ado, if you don't have any questions, we'll close the session. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.